This is the seventh Vial of Wrath, part 2. In part 1, we looked at the symbolic meaning of the pouring out of the vial into the air. Now we will look at this in a more literal way and see something quite interesting. Reflecting back on some of the things that we have considered previously, when we looked at the first trumpet in Revelation 8, this spoke of hail and fire mingled with blood. This was a symbol of the first wave of Gothic invasions, the Visigoths who fell upon the Western Roman Empire. The prophecy referred to hail, and in Europe hail comes down from the north, and this was the location from whence came the Visigoths. Also, this trumpet specifically mentions the earth, and the importance of this became clearer when we considered the next trumpet, which spoke of the sea. One wave of the Goths was confined mainly to the earth, the next was confined mainly to the sea. So when we came to the second trumpet, that gave us the eruption of the Vandals onto the scene, and this was described as a great mountain burning with fire cast into the sea. We saw that the imagery being used there was that of a volcano, and then also there was the sea. We considered that this marked out the area of the Vandals' rampage, the Mediterranean Sea, which has many volcanoes on its coast, hence the appropriateness of the symbol dovetailing in with the natural elements. Under the third trumpet, we saw the invasion of Attila the Hun, described in the prophecy as a great star falling from heaven. And at the time Attila was invading the area of Gaul in AD 451, lo and behold, Halley's comet appeared overhead. Also, this great star was to fall upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of water, and this was the area in Europe to which Attila was mainly confined. Once again, this symbolic prophecy found its fulfillment in the natural elements. Under the fifth trumpet, we looked at the rise of Islam under the Saracen Empire, and it was like locusts coming forth upon the earth with a period of devastation limited to 5 months, a symbolic period designating 150 years. We saw that the whole area that the Saracen Empire spread over is the same area that the natural locusts operate in, and furthermore, these natural locusts are their most active for only 5 months of the year. More recently, when we looked at the first vial of wrath, it was poured out upon the earth, and a noisome and grievous sore fell upon the man which had the mark of the beast. Like the first trumpet, the sphere of operation under the first vial is limited to the earth. The next one is going to be upon the sea. Under the first vial, there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and we saw that not only was the lifeblood of the French kingdom poisoned, but also its people and royal family were beset by smallpox. Once again, the symbolic prophecy also ties in with a natural occurrence of the same type. We saw the second vial poured out upon the sea, and every living soul died in the sea. And this took us to the time in history where Protestant England and Catholic Europe were pitted against each other for mastery of the seas. There were great naval battles at this time, which saw the destruction of the fleets of Papal Europe, those mainly of France and Spain. Then the third vial was poured out upon the rivers and fountains of water, and the same areas once ravaged by Attila under the third trumpet become the areas now ravaged by Napoleon and his armies. The areas, or the area of northern Italy where the fountains of waters are found, the source for many of the rivers in Europe. So now we come to Revelation 16 verse 17, and we read that the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air. Might not we be able to find an aspect of the fulfillment of this prophecy in the literal air? Might not this also become the main sphere of action under this vial? In light of what we have just looked at, this would not be outside of the scope of the meaning of the prophecy, and as we are going to see, the region of the air has indeed become a principal area of destruction following the end of World War I. The fact that this last vial, which takes us to the time commencing near to the end of the Ottoman Empire, that it should specifically mention the air as the scene of conflict is highly significant and truly wonderful when we start to consider human conflict down through the ages. In all previous generations, the scene of conflict and warfare has always been confined to the land, the seas, and the waterways. Men have fought with slings, bows and arrows, spears, swords, axes and shields, catapults, battering rams, siege engines or towers, and vessels. Then much later, we saw the coming forth of artillery, which was key to the fall of Constantinople, and with this later came guns, bombs, and different kinds of delivery methods. For much of the time, there has always been an infantry, a cavalry, and a navy. Untold millions and millions have died in this way down through the ages. Armies of men have marched from one nation into another. Ships have sailed, taking warfare and conquest to new regions of the earth. Men have struggled for control over territories, seas, oceans, and waterways. But never has this involved aerial warfare. That is, until the point was reached in this prophecy, the period near to the close of World War I and the end of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. This period brought with it technological advancement that could never have been anticipated by man, but it was known to our God, the God of the Bible, who declares the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done. And now at this point we read that the angel pours out his vial into the air, and this is remarkable indeed. With the opening of World War I, no nation was prepared for aerial warfare, and the reason for this can be seen in the thinking that existed near to this time. One Lord Kelvin, a British mathematician and physicist, said in 1895 that heavier than air flying machines are impossible. If God had intended that man should fly, he would have given him wings, is a quote widely attributed to George W. Melville, Chief Engineer of the US Navy, about the turn of the 20th century. Simon Newcomb, a Canadian-born US astronomer, said in 1902 that flight by machines heavier than air is unpractical and insignificant, if not utterly impossible. Wilbur Wright said, after a disappointing flying experiment in 1901, that man would not fly for 50 years. But after only 2 years of saying that, the Wright brothers undertook the first controlled, sustained flight of a powered, heavier-than-air aircraft on December 17, 1903, in North Carolina. And here was laid a key foundation stone for the next progression in world events, the coming of aerial warfare, and as the prophecy says, the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air. Even with the invention of aircraft, the prevailing thinking at the time was that this would make future wars impossible and that a new era of safety and security had come upon the earth. How little did so many of the pundits of the day perceive what was before them. In this article from WrightStories.com, which deals with the Wright brothers' perspective on the role of aircraft in war, we read that Orville Wright said, quote, "When my brother and I built and flew the first man-carrying flying machine, we thought we were introducing into the world an invention which would make further wars practically impossible. That we were not alone in this thought is evidenced by the fact that the French Peace Society presented us with medals on account of our invention. We thought governments would realize the impossibility of winning by surprise attacks and that no country would enter into war with another of equal size when it knew that it would have to win by simply wearing out the enemy. End quote. From Britannica.com, under the topic Air Warfare, we read, Air warfare is almost entirely a creation of the 20th century, in which it became a primary branch of military operations. Powered aircraft were first used in war in 1911 by the Italians against the Turks near Tripoli, but it was not until the Great War of 1914 to 18 that their use became widespread. At first, aircraft were unarmed and employed for reconnaissance. By the second year of the war, fighter tactics emerged on all sides, and on the left-hand side of this slide you can see a pilot up in his bi-wing, and he pulls out his revolver and he is shooting away at another aircraft below him. My oh my, how things were to change. The article continues, the next role to emerge for military aircraft was ground attack, in which planes, by strafing with machine guns and dropping rudimentary bombs, aided an advance on the ground, helped cover a retreat, or simply harassed the enemy. By war's end, a fourth vision of air power arose, that of an independent air force attacking the enemy far from the front lines, the purpose being to destroy essential elements of the enemy's war capability by bombing factories, transportation and supply networks, and even centres of government. This role was never effectively implemented in World War I. Thus, the basic roles that aircraft would play in modern war were presaged in World War I, namely reconnaissance, air superiority, tactical ground support, and strategic bombing. So what we are seeing here is the history matching with the development of the prophecy. Under the sixth Vial, we had World War I and the end of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and at this very point there emerges a new kind of warfare, a weapon which would end up taking destruction to the ends of the earth, and I'm going to talk more about this. Also, if you have not seen it already, I'll direct your attention back to Revelation chapter 16, the sixth Vial, part 3, where we saw the central role that aircraft played as birds flying in the deliverance of the ancient city of Jerusalem from the hands of the Turks. The timing of all of these things matches in so well with the prophecy that it's impossible to overlook its significance, in my opinion. Now, as we know, the Allies defeated the Central Powers and World War I came to an end in November 1918, and subsequently there came the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and in this it was hoped and expected that what had occurred had been the war to end all wars. The people were told and genuinely believed that all future conflicts would now be settled by negotiation and diplomacy. Poor, foolish people. But then again, has anything changed? Most people to this very day automatically tend to believe whatever their government and the mainstream media tells them, and it seems they most certainly do not want to hear an opposing point of view. Here we read part of a commentary on the Treaty of Versailles, which says, the treaty included the Covenant of the League of Nations, in which members guaranteed each other's independence and territorial integrity. Economic sanctions would be applied against any member who resorted to war. But while they all talked of peace, all the same nations again prepared for war. The drums of war started to beat again, and all the nations started to rearm and develop new weapons of war, but this time each would have its own dedicated air force. It was not until the 1930s that things really started to get underway, especially as it relates to the angel pouring out his vial into the air. Benito Mussolini came along and envisaged a revived Roman Empire. In this article from dailymail.co.uk we read, Benito Mussolini, the dictator who wanted to revive the Roman Empire, Mussolini dreamed of refounding the Roman Empire and launched a series of conquests in Africa, including that of Ethiopia, then uncolonized and ruled by King Haile Selassie. At this time, the Italians were already in Africa due to a colony that they had in northern Somalia. Here, the Italians were at war with the Abyssinians, which is the nation of Ethiopia that we have today. From this article dealing with the Second Italo-Abyssinian War of 1935 to 1936, we read, Italy's overwhelming military superiority, notably its air power, left little doubt about the outcome. By early May 1936, Italian forces had entered Addis Ababa and Emperor Haile Selassie had been forced to flee. The Italians had the advantage, as the Abyssinians were quite a primitive people which lacked the weapons to fight a modern war. Unfortunately for them, the Italians dropped mustard gas upon them from the air using aircraft which had been blessed by the Vatican to do God's will. And of course, this is nothing new when it comes to the Church of Rome, as most people listening to this will probably recognize. Aircraft delivered mustard gas right over the top of the Abyssinians with no discrimination between military or civilian targets. Then in 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out, which lasted until 1939. On the one side there were the Republicans, who were left-leaning and were in an alliance of convenience with the anarchists and communists, and they were fighting against the Nationalists, a Catholic and largely aristocratic conservative group led by General Francisco Franco. The war was tipped in the favour of the Nationalists when the Germans and the Italians sent in their air force called the Condor Legion and bombed Madrid, Barcelona, and most notoriously a place called Guernica, and here began what became to be known as terror bombing. Concerning this, we read from the Wikipedia Bombing of Guernica article, The bombing of Guernica, April 26, 1937, was an aerial attack on the Basque town of Guernica, Spain, causing widespread destruction and civilian deaths during the Spanish Civil War. The raid by planes of the German Luftwaffe Condor Legion and the Italian fascist Aviazione Legionera was called Operation Rugen. The reason why this began what became known as terror bombing is made clear in this article from Art and Popular Culture, still dealing with the bombing of Guernica, which says, the bombing has often been considered one of the first raids in the history of modern military aviation on a defenseless civilian population, although the capital, Madrid, had been bombed many times previously. Terror bombing was a new doctrine introduced into aerial warfare that involved the deliberate targeting of civilians in order to break the will or aid the collapse of the enemy. So we can see that as the 20th century was progressing, the sphere of Operation the Vial being poured out into the air was now bringing in people who once would never have been in battle. At least they would not have been at the front line, but now the front line was coming to them. What the Germans and Italians had been doing in the Spanish Civil War was giving them good practice for World War II. On the 1st of September 1939, World War II began as the Germans invaded Poland with a three-front blitzkrieg. They attacked the Polish army with an overwhelming force of 1.5 million troops, backed by tactical aircraft in the sky and mobile armour on the ground. Not much occurred with the opening period of World War II, but then came the German invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940 and the bombing of Rotterdam, and concerning this we read from military history the following. The Rotterdam Blitz was the aerial bombardment of Rotterdam by the Luftwaffe on 14th May 1940, during the German invasion of the Netherlands in World War II. Even though preceding negotiations resulted in a ceasefire, the bombardment took place nonetheless in conditions which remain controversial and destroyed almost the entire historic city centre, killing nearly 900 civilians and leaving 30,000 people homeless. How was Rotterdam destroyed? it was destroyed by aerial bombardment. Hundreds and hundreds of bombs and incendiary devices were dropped from the sky. Great hail out of heaven falling upon men, and this continued all through World War II. So you can see how the prophecy is developing in its fulfillment. As the angel poured out his vial of wrath into the air, the cities of the nations begin to fall, and every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, and I'm going to talk more about this later. Whereas once it was safe to be well behind enemy lines while the sons and fathers went out to battle to fight the enemy, now no one is safe. The conflict is taken well behind enemy lines to where civilians live. The usually safe place of the home front now becomes the new front line as the angel pours out his vial into the air and aerial warfare takes on new and devastating dimensions. This is the end of part 2. Part 3 will follow immediately where I have just left this.